As a warning, this episode discusses suicide, domestic violence and abuse. If you need help, call Lifeline on 0800 543 354 or text help to 4357. You can also contact the Women's Refuge line on 0800 Refuge or the Shine helpline on 0508 744 633 at any time. Kia ora, welcome to this episode in Season 5 of Recovering. I'm Frank Ritchie, minister, chaplain and radio broadcaster. Recovering is a Media Chaplaincy New Zealand podcast highlighting the excellent work of Aotearoa New Zealand journalists. Media Chaplaincy is a team of chaplains around the country offering free, independent and confidential support for media professionals. In each episode of this podcast, I sit down with a leading journalist to discuss the story that's had the biggest impact on them both personally and professionally. In this episode, I sat down with Tommy Livingston. Tommy is a former award-winning journalist, but is now a counsellor, coach and speaker, and someone we have close ties with at Media Chaplaincy. During his time at Stuff, Tommy mainly reported on crime and has covered some of New Zealand's biggest and most complex cases. In this episode, we discuss the story of a young man charged with the murder of his father.
It was like a holy moment for everyone involved because this boy, in an instant, you could just tell part of him had been healed.
The story highlights Tommy's empathy, nuance, and his deep care for the well-being of others. We also cover his changing career paths, processing trauma, and being mistaken for Prince Harry. Tommy, you and I have known each other for a little while, so it's a pleasure to have you here. And I have to just point out that we are in one of RNZ's studios, so a big thanks to RNZ for their generosity. Now, I know that you were a crime reporter. You're not anymore. We're going to talk about that change sometime in this podcast, but I want to start somewhere where you asked me not to start. I want to start with you being mistaken for Prince Harry.
Thanks, Frank. Yes, so I was mistaken for Prince Harry. Now, when I recall the story, memories are a funny thing, and so I can't be sure whether I was mistaken by hundreds of people or whether it was only a small group of people. But Prince Harry came to Wellington. I was a student journalist, and me and my mate were asked to go to the rugby game, see if we could interview Harry or try and get some quotes from Harry or find Harry at the game. Of course, we didn't get anywhere near him, but at the end of the game, they brought the press pool down onto the field so that we could walk across and interview. I think it was the Hurricanes that were playing. And as we walked across the field, we were obviously in this sort of circle of people, and there was this one red-haired me that was in the middle of the circle, and the crowd erupted. And I was like, what's going on? And my friend said, I think they think you're Prince Harry. So I waved, and it caused even more of a reaction. So I had this small moment of feeling like a royal. So that's my sort of mistaken identity story.
Now, since hearing that, I've put your pictures up side by side.
Yeah, and you can see the resemblance.
No.
Oh, really?
Aside from the fact that you're both redheads.
Yeah, well, look, that often happens for redheads. You know, people find it very difficult to sort of see past just the hue of our hair. And so I get mistaken for Ron Weasley. That's been a common... I can see that one. Yeah, Ed Sheeran. So, yeah, it's a common thing.
All redheads look the same.
Exactly.
Now, I wanted to start somewhere light because your career in journalism was quite heavy, focusing on crime for Stuff. But before we dive into that, talk to me about how you got into journalism. Why journalism?
I got into journalism after hearing a talk from Jahan Castaneda, who's another great New Zealand journalist, and he was quite young, and I was young too. And I heard him speak about his career at that stage, and that really interested me. And so I then started writing for my local paper, a little column that I would write about high school issues. And when I read back on that column now, I just cringe. It was very, very terrible. But started writing for my local paper, and then I went to university. Did a BA and then journalism school after that. And then while I was at uni, I managed to have a little segment on TVNZ7's show Backbenchers, which was a live political show, which was a huge privilege to be able to have a little segment and cut my teeth at live TV. And then managed to have a few good runs at journalism school and then landed a job at the Dominion Post here in Wellington.
And crime, how did you end up in reporting crime?
A little bit by accident. So while I was at journalism school, I became quite interested in this cold case in the South Island. And so I thought it would be a good idea to buy some Jetstar flights, go down to the South Island, hire a car, and go and interview someone that was involved in that case. And just the way that things played out, I managed to get a good interview, and then I was on work experience and the person that I'd interviewed died, and then that became the story, and I sort of had the interview, and then it all kind of went from there. So I kind of backed my way into crime reporting. I didn't seek it out, but that was, my time in journalism was largely just covering destruction and mayhem, which was a real experience.
The nature of the cold case, what was it? If we're talking very early in your career, one of the reasons I ask is because I'm guessing, since we're talking about crime, that it's not just something vanilla. And so to be reporting on some of the stuff as a young journalist would have been a big deal.
Yeah, it was a big deal. That case in particular was the Kirsty Bentley case. So a young girl who had gone for a walk on New Year's Eve and then never come home. And a few weeks later, her body was found, but her killer was never caught. But her father was always suspected of being involved in her murder, even though he was never charged. So I went down and interviewed Sid, was his name. And at that point in his life, he had spent, 20 years under suspicion of murdering his daughter. And that had really affected him. His life had kind of fallen into disrepair. And when I met him, he was dying, essentially. I think he had late-stage cancer. And I walked into this house, and it was the house that Kirsty had grown up in. It was the house that she had left from when she'd gone on that walk. And it was dusty, and it was dirty, and the carpet was worn from where Sid sat all day watching TV. But the one thing that didn't have any dust on it was the photo of his daughter that he kept pristine clean.
Wow.
And so we had a conversation about what it had been like for him to be accused by so many people of being involved in his daughter's death, but never being charged for that. And him professing his innocence, and how his life had been ruined from that experience. And then, I didn't do anything with that interview, but then a few months later he died, and I just happened to be at work experience at the Dominion Post when that happened. And so I walked over to the editor and said, Sid Bentley has died. I did the last interview with Sid. Here it is. And that opened, a lot of doors for me.
How old were you?
I would have been probably 20, 21. Yeah, so pretty young. Yeah, when I look back on it now.
Yeah, very young.
Yeah.
How did you, I don't know if it's a strange question, because you might not have done any processing around it, but how do you process a story that significant in interviewing a man who is going to be extremely complex, grief, possibly killed his daughter, no way to really know. How do you process that at 20?
I don't think you do process it. In fact, I was pretty naive. But I think that helps sometimes, particularly when you're working in that area where you're not fully aware of the spectrum of human suffering. And so you get exposed to that in journalism. That's one of the things that I actually really valued about that job, was being able to meet people who had completely different life experiences to me. But there was no way of processing that. And, as my career went on, and particularly covering more and more intense crime stories, I realized that actually in journalism we're often very poorly equipped to be able to talk through and process and understand what it is that we're actually putting ourselves in front of. So certainly from a young age, I had no real mechanism to try and understand what it was I was doing. I was just kind of trying to do what I thought a journalist would do, which was go and interview someone and then tell their story.
Yeah, we're going to talk more about that later, the tools, when we talk about what you do now. Yeah. But diving into crime then, as a really young person, surely there's emotions that come up as you're sitting in courtrooms hearing some of the most horrific stuff that humans get up to.
While thinking about this interview, a number of stories that I hadn't thought about for a long time came back to me, memories that cause a physical reaction when I think of them. I was thinking on the drive in here about one day I was asked to go and knock on the door of a husband whose wife had been murdered, and they'd only been married, I think a couple of months. And I hopped in the car with the photographer. We drove out to the house, and we were sitting outside the house, and I just desperately didn't want to do this. I'd done door knocks before, but I just had a really bad feeling about this one. And
Can I just say, that's a very human feeling.
Yes.
What a journalist is doing in that situation, while necessary to get the story and possibly give someone a chance to talk things out and tell their story, it's not a human thing to do. Just to knock on a stranger's door to talk to them about the death of someone important in their life.
I know that now. Yeah. I didn't know that at the time. And I was lucky. The photographer that was with me was really supportive, and he just, he'd done this hundreds of times. He was an old hand, but he was really empathetic, and he just said, take your time, but you do need to do this. Do you want me to come with you, or do you want to do it alone? And I said, I want to do this one alone. I just felt like it needed only one person, not two, showing up at the door. As I got out of the car, I could hear people talking, so I just waited a little bit. I was sort of standing behind a hedge before I walked into the house, and I quickly realized that the conversation that I was overhearing was the conversation around what they were going to bury this woman in. And they were talking to the funeral director, and a few moments later the funeral director sort of walked past me carrying the clothes and the shoes that she was taking back to put on this body. And then I was going to walk in and knock on the door and ask if I could tell the story. And it just felt so confusing. I don't have words to describe that feeling of both wanting to run away but also wanting to get the story, and the moral conflict that goes on inside of you. And I went and I knocked on the door, and they told me to go away, which is, understandable. But it's moments like that they come back to you at times, and you really wonder, if I was there again, would I do that differently? What would I say to that young person now, trying to grapple with that really complex moral dilemma?
Have you reflected on anything that you would say to them?
I think similarly to what you said earlier, is that this is an incredibly unnatural thing to do, and it's okay that you don't want to do this, and it's okay that this feels wrong, because in many ways it is wrong. But also I would say that everyone has the opportunity to say no as well. And so when you knock on a door, they can say no, and that's okay. And I've had times where families have said, yes, we want to talk to you. Please come inside. We want to share about our loved one's life. And so that's okay too. That's why I think that door knocks in themselves are not necessarily always entirely bad. I just wish perhaps maybe I'd gone back to the newsroom and there'd been a better way to kind of debrief on that, other than to kind of go down to the pub.
Why did you keep at it? I mean, that's a horrific early experience. Why keep going?
I kept going because I really love talking to people, and I felt like when we did it right, we could really help people. When we told someone's story in a really dignified and respectful way, that can actually sometimes be healing. And I always felt like I was doing my journalism a little bit differently, because, often in the newsroom they would talk about the importance of boundaries and not staying in touch with contacts, or not sort of over-identifying with families. But I never was good at that, So often I would stay in touch with, grieving family members or people that I'd written stories about. And I think what was happening there was actually something was potentially shifting, which was the beginnings of me leaving journalism in a way, because I was recognizing that I actually care so much about hearing people's stories and helping to facilitate healing. That was what was interesting me, not so much the story itself. So I think that's what was keeping me sort of going back and putting myself in these situations.
I just want to affirm that continuation of relationship with some of the subjects of your stories, though. Some of the best journalists I've sat down with keep those relationships going because they recognize that, especially when you're dealing with vulnerable people, that a trust has been built. To get someone to tell their story and be vulnerable with you, a trust has to be built. And then for them to then share their story, to then just leave them to it because you got the story, just feels wrong. So I would say some of New Zealand's best journalists are people who keep those friendships and those relationships going. So I want to affirm that. I think it was a good trait. I don't think you can get really good stories without that sense of empathy. And people can smell that a mile away, whether you're just in it for the story or whether you're there to truly help in some way, which journalism can do. We're going to chat later about the shift out of journalism, but the story that you want to unpack, I've done a number of these interviews now, and a number of them have been quite big and significant, but the story that you want to unpack is probably the one that's made me the most emotional, partly because of how you told the story, but then the nature of the story itself. So do you want to introduce us to the story?
Yeah. So to begin with, this is a story that changed my life, and I'll explain how it changed my life. But essentially, I was a court reporter in Auckland for a period of time, and a case came up that I didn't really know much about, but I started to follow it and then went along to the trial. And it was a story of a young boy who had killed his father. And this young boy had grown up in a family that was in the grip of addiction, poverty, gangs, violence, and his father, this young boy's father, was a tyrant, but also a loving dad. And one night, like so many nights,
Firstly, let's pause there. Violent and loving dad in the same sentence in a lot of people's head doesn't work. How are you able to put those two things together?
You know, humans are complex, and we are more than the worst thing that we've ever done. And when you spend time with people like you do, Frank, you understand, right? There's no black and white. There's often just a lot of grey when it comes to who we are and what we do and what motivates us and what makes us us. And so I have no problem, and I could completely understand when this young man would say, I loved my dad, but I was scared of my dad. I really understood that. So one night, this dad had a massive rage. He bit his wife. He was terrorizing the family, and the young boy went outside thinking that his dad had left the property. His dad was actually hiding. They got into an altercation. The young man had taken a knife with him when he went outside, and in the altercation, he had stabbed his father. His father
6 times.
6 times, yeah, and once through the heart. And his father died in his arms. So that got brought to the High Court. He was charged with murder. And when you're charged with murder, if you are convicted of that murder, then you are spending 10 years in prison, non-parole, 10 years of your life. This young man, when he came to trial, had a 2-month-old baby. So if he had been found guilty, he would not have spent any time with that young girl until she was at least 10 years old. So the stakes could not be higher. And it was just an incredible snapshot of this part of New Zealand society that we know exists, but often is not personalised. And in this trial, day after day, this family had to get up and talk about the complex nature of the relationship they had with the deceased. This man who was loving, who was a protector, but also a man who was addicted to meth, who was in a gang, who would violently beat them. And it was very difficult because they felt a lot of shame talking about their father, talking about this man, but also they knew that they needed to provide the context as to how this young man had ended up stabbing his father 6 times.
And the defence was that it was self-defence, yeah?
The defence was that it was self-defence, that the young man was trying to protect himself and his family. And as the trial went on and you sort of understood, I understand this more now because, as we'll talk about, I now work in therapy. But when you grow up with a parent that's either scared or scary, that makes it very difficult for anyone to be able to kind of regulate their emotions and keep themselves calm. And so what you saw was this family where everyone was traumatized. No one knew how to act or respond when dad was having a rage. And it was incredibly painful to see this young man have to listen to his mum give evidence about the amount of times that she was beaten and brutalized, the amount of times that she had to protect her children from this man, but also the loving nature of this man and how confusing it was for them, the unpredictability of his behaviour. It was heart-wrenching.
I'm not sure if this will sound condescending or not. I don't want it to sound condescending. I want it to sound quite honouring. When I read the big story, the end of the trial, when you wrote up the whole thing, I read something that was very nuanced, that was extremely mature, and that did not just dive into clickbait and the easy story of good versus evil. It would have been, I would imagine, very easy to be sitting in that courtroom and just see the dad as a horrific, evil man who got his comeuppance, essentially. But you didn't do that. How do you maintain your cool when you're sitting in a courtroom and not allow those emotions to overcome you?
One of the things that happened in that trial in particular was in a courtroom, often the press bench is quite close to where the defendant sits in the dock. And I was often at the end of the press bench sitting very close to this young man. And as the trial went on, there's lots of breaks and there's times where the court is empty of the public and you have time to chat. And, I would spend time talking to the defendant. And we actually grew up not far from one another. And so I identified with his story to some degree, even though our lives were very, very different. And as I would talk to him, I got a sense of how much he loved his dad and how painful it was that this had happened. And so there was no way in which I was ever going to write a story where the dad was the monster. At the heart of this story was the fact that this was a very complicated man who had done very horrible things. But it would have been too easy to say that he was a monster. The defence said that he was like Jake the Muss, and they likened the family as being like once were warriors. And I think when you watch that film, you can see, and to some degree, that Jake the Muss has nuances. He's not one-dimensional. So it was really important to me when I wrote the story at the end of the trial, particularly because I interviewed the defendant a week after, that I wanted to make sure that I was honouring the family and trying to present an accurate picture of what their life had been like.
What was the outcome of the trial?
Well, let me step back a little bit. As the trial was going on, I became increasingly aware that I probably wasn't going to be in journalism for the rest of my life. And that's because one day I was sitting in this courtroom and I became quite transfixed by the trial. I ended up going in on my days off and making sure that I was sort of across all the evidence. I didn't want to miss anything. I became overly invested in what was going to happen. And as the trial was going on, there was one day where I was sitting in the courtroom and this almost like an audible voice sort of came to me. And the line was, "You're sitting in the wrong seat." And it just helped to clarify so much for me that actually I was sitting in the wrong seat. Like, this was the kind of area I wanted to work in. I wanted to be in these places and spaces and amongst these types of people. But I was probably just sitting in the wrong seat in the room. And that was a massive revelation for me. And so I was really emotionally attached to the outcome of this trial. The day that the court was adjourned, the jury went out. And often, in a court case, you can be waiting days for verdicts to come back. In this instance, it was 4 hours. The jury knock on the door and they say, "We have verdicts." And then there's 15 minutes and everyone rushes back into the courtroom. There's nothing like the moment where the jury enters and they're asked to read out the verdict. There is just an emotion that I can't sort of describe, but it feels like you're holding on to an electric fence, particularly because you're invested in what has happened, but also you have to file straight away. So you really want to make sure you hear exactly what's happened, you take in the energy of the courtroom, and then you file immediately. The jury came in and there was just tension. This young man's entire family was there, his 2-month-old daughter was there, and they read out "not guilty." And he collapsed. He walked out of the dock. He came and shook my hand, which meant a lot to me. And he ran out and hugged his daughter. The jury were crying. The lawyers were crying. I think everyone was just so emotional. The court was then adjourned and everyone kind of filed out. And, you get used to seeing this after a court case, this kind of sense of relief or shock or disappointment or frustration at the end of a trial. And he was just standing there, this young man with his family and holding his baby. And to the side was the Crown prosecutor. And this is very unusual. This is the man who had been putting forward the case that this young boy should be charged with murder and sent to prison. And he just came over and said to this young man, "Do you mind if I give you a hug?" And he hugged them and just said, "Congratulations, I hope you go and live your life now."
That bit of the story, when I read it in your write-up, and I'm very glad you included it, was the bit where I almost lost it reading the story. Because, again, it's very easy just to see prosecutors. When you're on the side of the defendant, it's very easy just to paint the prosecutors as the bad guys. But the justice system exists as it does for a reason. So there has to be people on both sides of that equation. So to see the humanity of the prosecutor towards him and the empathy of the prosecutor, so very, very good.
And here's the thing, right? I am lucky in the work that I do now that you see sometimes these special moments where healing takes place. And a lot of the time, though, I don't get to see it. It happens sort of when I'm not looking or when I'm not there. But that moment where you have 12 strangers telling this boy, "We see you, we understand you, we know that you didn't mean to do this, and you're free," was a very sacred thing. It was like a holy moment for everyone involved, because this boy, in an instant, you could just tell part of him had been healed, and that was incredibly powerful and something that I'll never forget.
For you, I think what made you, and that line that you heard in the courtroom, what made you, and I feel slightly torn about this, because I think what made you the wrong person to be sitting there also made you very right to be sitting there.
Sure.
Because I don't think there are loads of amazing journalists in New Zealand. That's why I do what I do, because I think the industry is really important. I love everybody that I get to sit down with. But to capture the humanity in the way that you did of so many of the players in that story, that's something special. And I think it's what makes you very good at what you do now. And of course, it's the reason why you ended up moving out, but it's also what made you great at what you did. But the move out of journalism, what did that look like?
So it began in that trial where I started to have this realization. And I appreciate what you're saying. I think for me, what had begun to happen was that I was prioritizing the people over the story. And I don't know whether that is actually what a journalist should be doing, because I think ultimately, potentially, a journalist needs to prioritize the story because the story needs to be told. There is a balance there, but my balance, I think, was quite off. So I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew I needed to leave. And in hindsight, I stayed too long. I didn't quite get out probably when I should have got out. And as a result, my mental health suffered. But when I did manage to figure out what the route out was, it was good. And I decided that I wanted to move into mental health, and I wanted to do a master's of counselling. And so just before the pandemic kind of took off, we just started writing about this virus in China. I handed in my resignation. I got my $50 Prezi card for my years of service, and then began studying, and then emerged after COVID with a degree in counselling, and now my life is working as a counsellor and a coach with people to help improve their lives.
Firstly, I hope you didn't spend that $50 all in one place.
No, I'm sure. I'm pretty sure I was very responsible in the way that I managed that.
Very good. In the position that you're in now then, as a counsellor, and it's worth pointing out here that you're the person that we refer people to if we think we need to escalate above what chaplaincy is and we need some more expertise. So there are a number of journalists now who through Media Chaplaincy have had the chance to sit down with you, and all the feedback has been great.
That's good to know.
Everything that comes back to me has been magnificent. When you look back then, and you particularly think about those early years, with what you know now, what tools do you hope would be available, particularly for young journalists coming in, but people having to deal with that big, heavy stuff?
I think what surprised me is that when I moved into working in the therapy space is that I felt like actually the two jobs, being a therapist and a journalist, were not entirely different in a way. As a therapist, I'm still trying to help someone tell their story. I'm still asking them a lot of questions. I'm still talking about really challenging content, but I'm also sort of taking them on a journey. I think the thing that I realized when I left journalism was that when you become a counsellor or you work in mental health, you have what's called supervision, which is a requirement that you have to have supervision, once monthly. And I really didn't understand why, as journalists, we didn't have something similar, a regular check-in where you talk to someone about what it is that you are covering, what you've been exposed to, and anything that you might need to help process that. Because I don't think there's any particular one tool that someone may need. And I also think that at different times in your career, you have different pressures and different strains. And also that for a lot of journalists, they may not ever actually be exposed to high levels of trauma because they are maybe working in business or other areas of reporting that were very different to what I was doing. But I do think having some kind of supervision that is normalized within newsrooms would be really, really good. I think that's why Media Chaplaincy is great at what it does to try and fill that gap. But I do think that newsrooms are doing a disservice to their people, and often these people are quite young, to not try and provide some support when it comes to debriefing big things.
I think it's shifting, but I think that idea of supervision, regular check-in, deliberate regular check-in, not just past the water cooler or on the occasion where you sit down with your boss, I think it is a really good idea. I do want to push back slightly on the idea that maybe that level of trauma is not there if people aren't sitting in the likes of courtrooms. But when I think through people that I've sat down with who are doing business, reporting on business, for instance, there's the what's the Reserve Bank doing now, etc. But then there's the people who are losing their jobs or so-and-so is abusing so-and-so in their workplace. Or if we think about the sports arena, there's the young athletes who something happens that involves abuse of power, coaching. I can think across a number of different stories. So I think that trauma, I think it's the nature of journalism to eventually expose the journalist to trauma because you're ferreting out the stuff that is unusual and often that's going to involve trauma. So I think it's there across the board.
I agree with you. And I think one of the things is helping people to recognize when they have been exposed to something that could be potentially traumatic. And I think this is the difficult thing. And what we know about trauma when you're exposed to it in particular is that you may not actually feel like anything has gone wrong at the time. And because we're so busy, we just sort of carry on with the job. But, I now know as a therapist that actually when you are exposed to high levels of trauma, particularly over a prolonged period of time, that does impact your nervous system. And we often are just really bad at recognizing, maybe the reason I'm not sleeping is because of what I have been exposed to at work, or maybe the reason I'm having trouble in my relationship is that I'm finding it difficult to process certain emotions. So I definitely agree with you on that front.
Yeah. I might have mentioned this previously on the podcast, I can't recall, but I remember getting a group of media personnel in Christchurch in the room with a counsellor, and I had a chat with each of them before we had them in the room together. And each of them told me about stuff that was going on in their life, reasons they were visiting their GP, stomach upsets, couldn't sleep, had heart palpitation issues. And I remember sitting them in the room, and none of them connected to the stories that they'd been through, the earthquake, the shooting, various other things Christchurch has dealt with. But I sat them in the room and I got them to go around, just talk about what's going on in their life. Each of them mentioned the thing that they'd talked to me about. And then I got the counsellor to list the symptoms of PTSD. Every one of them had a light bulb moment. That's what they'd been through and hadn't recognised it. I find that, sad on one account, but then there's hope there as well, because I think people are becoming more aware of it.
I think particularly when we look at professions like journalism, there's a particular type of trauma called vicarious trauma that I think is useful for people to understand, because when we go to an event like a shooting or an earthquake or a door knock, we're being exposed to someone else's trauma most of the time. We are the ones, like a first responder, that is running towards the event to try and record it. And so therefore, often people find it very difficult to be able to claim any sense of emotional toll over that, because it can feel selfish or wrong. But we know that it's a real thing. And I think particularly when we look at people that do respond to events, journalists are in a very challenging position, because unlike the paramedic or the police officer who goes in and does something active, a journalist is there to just observe and then report. And I found that passiveness, in a way, is very difficult for people to be able to sometimes process, because they think all I did was sort of interview people and then wrote a story, and they maybe can't see the benefits of what they are doing, but also the feeling that they didn't help can sort of compound the emotional distress that comes from that.
I remember meeting an older journalist here in New Zealand for the first time who covered a well-known massacre from a number of decades ago, and Media Chaplaincy was fairly new on the scene. And so he asked who I was. I was wearing my clerical collar at the time, so I stood out in a room. And so I explained to him that I'm a chaplain, and here's what I do, and here's why I serve media personnel. And he said to me, I wish you guys had been around decades ago when I covered this story. And he told me about the story. And he was in tears. He'd never processed it with anybody. He'd never talked about it over the years. And here we have this slight moment where he gets to bring it up and he's in tears. I've sat down with people who covered the Christchurch massacre a year after it happened and never talked to anybody about it in that time. I'm thinking about you and all the stories that you've covered. And you mentioned that even sitting down to do this caused you to reflect on some stuff. How are you processing all the stuff that you've seen?
I am processing, well, I think in my current role, I still talk to people that have gone through very, very difficult things. And what I have realized, particularly in the job that I do now, last week I spoke to someone whose brother had died from suicide. I spoke to a mother whose child had died. I spoke to politicians. I spoke to people that were representing New Zealand in sports. So I lurch sometimes between like immense joy to immense grief to immense pain to immense hope. And I've realized that that's okay, and that it's normal for me to bounce between those emotional places. And in the midst of all of that, for me, I have grounded myself, probably because I believe that it's all going to be okay in the end. Is sort of where I get to. I sort of trust the process of therapy, of my own processing. I know that I'm ultimately going to land in an okay place. So that's kind of what gives me peace. But it is challenging when I look back and I think of some of the stories that I covered, because I do want to go back and apologize to some people. Now that I understand the nature of trauma, now that I understand the nature of grief and pain, I definitely know that there are some people where I added to that, and I'm really sorry for that. So yeah, I've had some reckonings in a way, but the work that I'm doing now is very meaningful and probably a way to make up for some of that too, if that makes sense.
One of our biggest audiences for this podcast is other media personnel, because everybody listens to each other's stuff. Alongside the possibility of supervision, sitting down with a chaplain, sitting down with a counsellor, what are some other little things that people could possibly do in their day-to-day life if they are encountering stuff that is disturbing?
So there's three things that I often try and talk to clients about, which is noticing, naming, and normalizing. So noticing what you're feeling, naming those emotions, and then normalizing the fact that you are feeling those emotions is really critical. Because often what happens is that people get into patterns of emotional repression where they feel something and they think, I shouldn't feel that. And so they try and find a way to kind of square that emotion, whether that's through drinking or distraction or working. And so actually just a really simple thing that we can do is just to notice the emotion, name the emotion, call it out. I'm actually feeling anxious going into this door knock, or I'm actually feeling anxious sitting down here with Frank talking about this right now. And then normalizing it, accepting that emotion is here and that it's normal and human to feel those things. That's a really easy thing that people can just begin to do that I actually think often creates massive shifts in people that have got into really bad habits of trying to repress emotion. And when I look back on the people that I used to work with, and these people, a lot of them are still my friends, they can recognize too that they've been stuck in patterns where there's been a lot of emotional repression, because that's kind of the culture, or was the culture in newsrooms when I was there. Yeah.
One of the most consistent things I hear when I sit down with people is someone will tell me something and how they feel, or like the door knock. Door knock is just a wonderfully classic example. And then they have someone like me, or even yourself, across the other side of the room going, yeah, that's not normal. That's not human. The way you feel is normal. For some, that's a complete revelation. I think it's partly because there's been this stereotype in the newsroom too that everybody's kind of hard.
Yeah.
You know, you do your story, you knock back your black coffee and you move on. Thankfully, I think those days are moving on, especially as a younger generation comes through. We have a much bigger awareness of mental health, but it's good.
That's good to hear. I mean, I think I left, well, when I started journalism, it was sort of as the sun was setting on the golden years. Like I caught the last 2 minutes of the sunset, you know. The day I started at the Dominion Post was the day that they sort of had just finished a massive cull of 60 people left the day that I started. And so, but while I was there for the first few years anyway, there were big budgets to an extent, and then and sort of lots of editors, and it got smaller and smaller and smaller. But there definitely was still a culture of like things are dealt with at the pub. And, you know, I definitely got into unhealthy habits of drinking too much as a way to kind of process and chat with my mates at the end of a week. And so I'm really pleased to hear that things are improving. And actually, just recently, I caught up with a couple of friends of mine who still work in newsrooms, and no one was drinking, which was like really cool to see that, you know, at the end of a week, everyone is able to, not that alcohol's bad, but everyone was able to talk about their week and not rely on alcohol, which was a massive shift from when I first started in the newsroom.
Just something else that I'm curious about. We'll make this the last thing before I ask the last question. Distraction is big. It's big, I think, in many people's lives, not just journalists, but journalists, because the idea of being alone with our thoughts, that's scary for many people. It might not be a thing in your life, but I'm going to ask anyway. Is silence a thing in your life, a practice of silence, just sitting in silence with your head?
Definitely. Before I start a day, particularly when I'm in my therapy room, I try and sit in the seat that the client is going to sit in, and just spend a couple of minutes in silence. And I find that very, very helpful and grounding to be where the other person soon will be, and to think about all of the stories that have come from that seat, and how much of a privilege it is to be sitting on the other side and absorbing and hearing those stories. And so that for me is a really important thing to kind of ground myself in at the beginning of a day.
Imagine if every journalist, if every interviewer did that, just sat for a couple of minutes, imagining the other side of this, with the other person answering the questions they're about to be asked, what that experience is like. It'd be quite a significant practice.
I find it really freeing, and I think particularly, you know, people often say to me, oh, well, how do you carry so much pain that sort of is being spilled out in front of you? And I think what's really helpful to me, and I've had to learn this coming out of journalism, is that I'm not the great healer, and actually I'm not here to do the heavy lifting. My job is just to create a space and to listen and to ask questions and to hold hope. And so that is really important to me. Anytime that I find that I'm the one that is doing the heavy lifting, I'm doing something wrong. And anytime that I feel like I'm burning out, then it means I'm doing the job wrong. And I think that applies to journalism too, is that if you're finding yourself burning out, then you're probably doing something wrong. And it's time to readjust and rethink and reprioritize.
That's really healthy. You're going to have a unique perspective on our last question, which I ask everybody. The future of journalism in New Zealand, what do you think it looks like?
Well, I'm hopeful because I am still in touch with a lot of journalists and they're all really good people. And so it'll look different to what it looks like today. But I'm really hopeful because the people that I know who are working in journalism are all great people. So yeah, I don't know, but I'm very, very optimistic about where things are headed.
I want to close then, Tommy, by saying thank you. I've long appreciated you. Firstly, your work in journalism and the way that you approached your stories, the nuance you brought to the table, because obviously you're caring for the people way too much. I want to thank you for the work that you do now, and the skill you bring to that table, the care and attention you bring to that. I want to thank you for connecting with the work that we do with Media Chaplaincy, and not just running away from journalism when you could have, but now bringing your expertise, your history and your skill to the table to help the journalists that we pass your way. So thank you so much for who you are and for what you do.
Thank you, Frank.
Ngā mihi nui, Tommy. Thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me. Thanks to Radio New Zealand for hosting this series, and thanks to you for giving some of your precious time to listen. A big shout out to Mallory Carey and Josh Couch for producing this episode of Recovering. If you appreciate this podcast, please give us a 5-star rating and share it with someone else who would like it. And remember to follow it in your favourite app to catch future episodes. At Media Chaplaincy New Zealand, we value our media. We demonstrate this by offering free, independent and confidential support for media professionals. With a solid and caring team in various parts of the country, we're here to help. So if you work in the media industry and you want to chat with someone who's there to listen, head to mediachaplaincy.nz to arrange a catch-up, and the coffee's on us.